Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on the History Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Markus Vinzent. And today we're going to be discussing Marcion's Gospel and its relationship to the Gospel of Luke. But I'm also going to be asking some questions about the Marcion priority, because it is connected to the argument. Some will say that Marcion's Gospel came before Luke, but others will say it also came before Mark. So there are different opinions floating around there regarding that. And I also have the links to purchase Markus Vinzent's books in the description below and the pinned comment, including to the YouTube channel Patristica. It will be tagged in the description below. So if you haven't subscribed to that channel, in which Markus frequently appears on there, then go subscribe if you have not done so already. And that being said, Markus, thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, Jacob, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be with you and with your audience, of course. Yeah,
thanks for joining me once again. So the first part of the discussion, I want to talk about Marcion's Gospel and its relationship to Luke. And so we're going to be starting to look at the arrows in that diagram there. Where is it pointing? And so first off, let's do a little recap for some new people that are watching that may not really be understanding what we're talking about, or just not know much about Marcion. So what is Marcion's Gospel, and can you tell us how it's connected with the Gospel of Luke?
Pleasure, yeah. It's interesting to know that probably the first and the last one who had looked at the Gospel of Marcion in detail were Irenaeus and Tertullian. Irenaeus from the late 2nd century of Lyon, and Tertullian, beginning of the 3rd century of Carthage. When Irenaeus writes his book, written about around years 177, he makes a comparison between those Gospels that we know from the New Testament, so Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. But in his comparison, he adds a 5th Gospel, namely that of Marcion. He doesn't do so for another Gospel, let's say a Valentinian Gospel or the Gospel of Thomas, but he just chooses those 4 and the Gospel of Marcion. Now, why was that the case? It was the case because Irenaeus knew in defeating in his work against what he calls the heresies, he had to defeat 2 major opponents. The first one in those years were Valentinus, but the second one was Marcion of Sinope. So he had 2 major figures against whom he had to write and to defend. And in doing so, in his 5 big books on the heresies, he clearly makes an argument against the theology of the Valentinians. But his major argument against Marcion is an argument on Scripture. And that's quite different to the Valentinians. Why on Scripture? Because Irenaeus knew that, from what he knows and quotes, the only existing collection of Christian writings that carried the name New Testament was a collection which Irenaeus, just as anybody else in the 2nd and 3rd century, credits to Marcion of Sinope. So the question was, what kind of collection was that? It was a collection, according to Irenaeus and Tertullian, which was put together by this teacher who, as Clement says, was the oldest of these teachers like Valentinus, Justin, and others. And Marcion, like those others, after the Second Jewish War, made their way to Rome and established a Christian didaskaleon, a Christian school there. In this school, according to our witnesses, he had produced a collection of writings. And this collection of writings consisted of 1 Gospel and 10 Pauline letters, plus a preface that Marcion wrote and on which Tertullian gives us quite a detailed commentary, as for the entire collection. Now, for getting back to, Jacob, your question, what is specific now? The most interesting thing is that all of the witnesses we have mention that Marcion had shortened the Gospel of Luke, which, as a consequence, whether that's correct or incorrect, but as a consequence, it means that the two Gospels, Marcion's and Luke's, were most closely related if we compare Marcion's Gospel, for example, with Mark, Matthew, John, or any of the other Gospels we know of. Epiphanius is even a bit sharper by saying, well, these two Gospels are almost like mirrors of each other. If they were so closely related, the question, of course, then is, it can only be a literal relation. So the one must have known the text of the others. If it were true, what Tertullian and Irenaeus tell us, that Marcion's collection was a reduction of Luke's Gospel, then Marcion must have had Luke's text in his hand and had cut it down. This was the opinion, of course, that was held since Irenaeus claimed that Marcion was reducing the Gospel of Luke into a shorter version, namely his own. The major reductions were that Marcion's Gospel missed the entire birth and youth stories of Jesus, including the baptism by John. He also missed for example, the story of the Good Samaritan in the middle. And, of course, at the end, he missed the ascension of Christ. So that was the reason why Irenaeus claims that Marcion had simply shrunk down Luke's Gospel into a smaller version. The opinion was then supported by Tertullian and by many others later, and was held until roughly the beginnings and the highlights and high times of the Enlightenment. In the 18th century, people started looking more skeptically about those heresiological reports given by Irenaeus, but Tertullian, Epiphanius, and others. And because people became more skeptical about their apologetic writings anyway, thinking hard that what the portraits give us of those opponents must not necessarily be historically correct. People like Eichhorn, a great New Testament scholar of the 18th century, started questioning and asked whether it might not be the other way around, that potentially Irenaeus is making a claim, but that in fact Marcion was not cutting down on Luke, but rather expanding on Marcion's Gospel, the Gospel of Luke derived, which then would also alter a long-standing tradition that the Gospel of Luke was written in the 1st century. Because if Marcion, according to all witnesses, was making its way to Rome after the Second Jewish War in the years after 135 AD, then if Luke was not reducted by Marcion, but the other way around, Marcion's Gospel was prior to the Gospel of Luke, then the Gospel of Luke could only have been written after 135 of our 2nd century. Now, this is at stake, and I think this is maybe a first answer to your question.
So now I want to ask about the reconstruction of Marcion's Gospel, because there are some different opinions about what is in Marcion's Gospel and what's not in it. And as we've discussed in previous episodes, that Marcion's Gospel is primarily reconstructed from examining Tertullian Epiphanius' quotations of the Gospel. Now, do Tertullian and Epiphanius conflict with each other at all? when it comes to what they're saying is in the gospel and what's not in it?
Well, first we have to say, I mean, the witnesses like Tertullian and Epiphanius overlap for quite a good substantial amount. I mean, they both agree about what I've just said about the missing passages, these big missing passages of the youth stories, birth stories, youth stories, John the Baptism, but then also the Samaritan, and at the end, the Ascension. So the basics, I'd say, they agree with each other, despite the fact that Tertullian works potentially on a bilingual text of Latin and the Greek version, and Epiphanius just on a Greek text. And Tertullian beginning of the 3rd century, Epiphanius in the middle of the 4th century. Nevertheless, these two key witnesses are not the only ones. Yeah, we have other witnesses as well. We have Ephraim. Oh, I'm sorry, I need to switch my phone.
No problem.
So we have also other witnesses like Ephraim, Origen, Jerome, and a few more. So the basics, I think, are not in dispute with each other. And that shows also in the ways how this gospel has been reconstructed. Because as so many things that we don't have in the original version and form, like other gospels, Gospel of Mary and others, where we only have fragments or pieces. So we have to reconstruct as historians. That's the job we do. And it is interesting to see we have now a history of over 150 years of reconstructing this Gospel of Marcion. One of the earliest attempts to reconstruct the gospel was in the 19th century, was Adolf Hilgenfeld, a great scholar because he not only reconstructed the gospel, he also attempted to reconstruct the 10 Pauline letters that are preserved or have been preserved by Marcion. So he knew his stuff. And after him, and building on him, we have then further reconstructions. So we have one by the great New Testament scholar Theodor Zahn, who has written volumes on the canon of the early Christian church. Then after him, and building on him, almost a student of his, was Adolf Harnack. Harnack, one of the greatest German New Testament and patristic scholars, based at the end in Berlin, even being president of the Humboldt University and president of the academy there. All his life, he worked on Marcion. He wrote his first student work on Marcion, for which he was given a prize. He never published that during his academic active life because he was still working on this reconstruction of the gospel and of the Pauline letters based on Zahn. And only when he was 70 years old, in those times quite an age for an academic, he published finally this major breakthrough book about Marcion. Further, after Harnack, we have then a further reconstruction which was attempted by almost simultaneously 3 great scholars. One is Roth, another one is Bedun, and thirdly, it's Klinghardt. Now one could say, given the disparity and the differences between these reconstructions, and not to mention the electronic reconstruction, which has been done by Mark Bilby, if you take those 3 or 4 of the reconstructions of the modern times, which is just about 10 years old, again, you can say, well, when you look into the extent how they have reconstructed, there's a great variety. But that is only true in one sense. First of all, they all build on a similar, if not the same, methodology, which was used by Hilgenfeld and Harnack. So what's the outset? They all start, all 5, all 6, start with the witnesses that we have, with Tertullian, as you said, with Epiphanius, as you said, but also with all the other witnesses I mentioned. And if we look at what they have extracted from those witnesses, and Dieter Roth is probably the biggest minimalist amongst all of those reconstructors. On those witnesses, they agree to 98 to 99%. So there is almost no dispute in whether or not we claim that a witness gives us a verse or doesn't give us a verse. So that's hardly of any dispute. There are minimalistic ones, but which would not affect the overall outlook of either the big shape of that Gospel of Marcion or even a small part of it. Yes, it's nitty-gritty, a verse, a half a verse here, a half a verse there, but it doesn't change the outlook of this Gospel. Now, in addition to those witnessed parts, and that becomes then a bit more tricky for those people who read those reconstructions or who have established those reconstructions, are further methodological steps. Until Dieter Roth, so from Hilgenfeld to Dieter Roth, people were still working on the assumptions by reconstructing the text. That was the claim of Irenaeus. Hence, they believed that Marcion was cutting down a bigger gospel, namely the Gospel of Luke. And this had two consequences. The first one is most noticeable when you look at the type of reconstruction they present us with. They only give us the deviations from Luke's Gospel. What I mean by that is they only give us lists of those few verses where we are told chunks have been taken out by Marcion, birth stories, youth stories, baptism, and so forth. Yeah? And then only those few variations where the witnesses tell us that Marcion's text reads different from Luke's text. So what we are presented with are big, long lists. But these lists do not give us a sense of what Marcion's gospel was really about. They just give us the differences. And here, the methodological step that Bedouin and Klinghardt, likewise, and now also Bilby then, all three have taken, is that they regard, as rightly so, the text which they are reconstructing not just like a Swiss cheese, where we have holes and deviations, but where they regard this text of this gospel as a gospel text, as a narrative, not as a fragmentary text. And just to give you the two or three different versions that have been produced, and why then the small variations exist between the reconstructions of those three. Bedouin, as a baseline, takes the idea that this is a full text. Hence, whenever we don't have a witness that gives us a reference that, let's say, an opening of a story of one of the examples that are given, or one of the sayings which are given, which are embedded in a narrative, in a story, but where the beginning of the story is not being given as either absent or present, when Roth or Harnack or Hilgenfeld just have a blank, Bedouin sets the canonical text as a potential text. He marks that in brackets, so we always know when we read his reconstruction which of the parts are attested by our witnesses and which are not, but which are either not attested as being absent. So Bedouin takes these in brackets so that at the end of the day we get a full text of a gospel, so that we can understand if, for example, a core part of a story is attested, then Bedouin would give us the entire story in brackets, of course, except for the witness text which he marks without brackets. In a very similar way, even a bit more extended, is the work by Bilby. But Bilby builds on one additional tool, which is neither used by Roth nor by Bedouin, and neither by Klinghardt or Klinghardt only in a very marginal way. Namely, Bilby has a very close look at how the semantics work. And for this, he bases his text on a digital version. And he has worked on that for the last 10 years or longer, and refines his edition almost week by week or month by month. Klinghardt, compared to Bedouin, also introduces one additional criterion. And this criterion, which adds to Bedouin's idea of a narrative text, is that he noticed very often, I mean, Harnack knew it already, and Hilgenfeld and so on too, but Klinghardt makes it more systematic. And he noticed that every so often in canonical New Testament manuscripts, of which we have hundreds, that give us these texts from the 3rd century to the 15th century, every so often, in these manuscripts, or even references by the Church Fathers to New Testament texts from Luke, we find variations in those manuscripts, where the manuscripts differ from each other regarding certain terms or certain forms, or even certain verses. And comparing those variations with what the witnesses tell us about Marcion's text, that an awful lot of time, these so-called variations match exactly the text that the witnesses give us as Marcion's text. So Klinghardt places a great deal of effort in looking for those kinds of variations, particularly when we don't know by the witnesses whether verses are present or marked as absent. Hence, in addition to Bedouin's idea that text must be a text and not just fragments, so that he puts in brackets these texts, Klinghardt looks into these bracketed texts, and once, or if he finds a number of variations in the manuscripts, which would be coherent with similar expressions and similar lexicography in witnessed text by Marcion, he would draw the conclusion that these are hints that the texts as we have them in the canonical version, with the alteration of the variations in the manuscripts, that this variation text can be seen as a witness for a text that was present in Marcion's collection. So it's a sophisticated, but I think it is a well thought about approach to these texts, by which Klinghardt comes up with his own reconstruction. To give you my view, because I haven't produced so far, and potentially will not produce a reconstruction myself, but in comparing what I've done in doing a reconstruction of the 10 Pauline letters, which are, compared to Marcion's Gospel, underdeveloped. I mean, we have those old reconstructions in lists by people like Hilgenfeld too, by Zahn, and by Harnack, but even by Schmidt from the 1980s and 90s. But we don't have a full reconstruction of the Greek text yet in form of a narrative or in form of a letter. So that's what we don't have. And this is precisely what I'm going to publish at the moment. You will have 2 big, or rather 3 volumes, which are being published by Nach Franke in summer, and in a parallel text, the German expression and the implications and assessment of the reconstruction, which will come out with Herder. And I hope then potentially a year later or 2 years later, I will also be able to produce an English translation of the reconstruction and of the interpretation of that reconstruction of the Pauline letter collection. But what I've learned from doing this is that when we look at the forms of the reconstructions that we have, I mentioned Roth, Bedouin, Bilby, and Klinghardt, I would be a bit more cautious than almost all of them are. Maybe Bilby is the closest. Why? I noticed when I was doing the reconstruction that there is even one more additional methodological step that can help us in reconstructing also the gospel. Namely, I found that starting from the witnessed texts, that's always our start, starting from the witnessed texts, we can see there is a coherent lexicography, semantic, and the way the grammar is being handled in the entire collection of Marcion's New Testament, which runs through the Gospel and through the 10 Pauline letters. And that has helped me a lot in reconstructing these 10 Pauline letters. As a first step, in order to prove that, I've published last year a concordance of all 5,500 roughly words that appear in the canonical New Testament. And I've checked with each of these terms whether or not terms are witnessed as terms that appear in Marcion's New Testament, or whether these are terms that only appear in the canonical texts. I was greatly helped by a brilliant team to which Mark Bilby belongs, and he's even the head of the team. Then there is Lance, then there is Jack Bull. So we've worked together in meticulously looking through a computer-helped baseline. And that allowed us to go even beyond simple words and semantics, and we were able to see combinations like sentence openings, verse openings, like grammatical structures that are being typical for the canonical New Testament, but untypical or atypical for Marcion's text. So if we were to apply the same logic to the reconstruction of Marcion's gospel, I think one could see that Roth, Bedouin, and Klinghardt, in those parts which are more difficult to reconstruct because we don't have the witnesses telling us what we have to read, we could even be a bit more precise and probably less expanded than Klinghardt is, closer to Bilby and to Bedouin. But having said that, we should not forget this is marginal errors or marginal differences compared to the overall view, what we can have from Marcion's gospel. I think what Marcion's gospel is of little dispute today.
So in general, how much shorter is the Gospel of Marcion in comparison to the Gospel of Luke?
I haven't got the numbers, the precise numbers in my mind. I could look it up, but I would say it is about 1/3 length. But don't take my word for it in precision. But it's, I mean, we have an expansion of about, we have 1/3 compared to 3/3 in Luke. And this is, by the way, pretty similar to the expansion that we have from the Pauline letters, from the 10 letter collection to the 14 letter collection in the canonical New Testament.
What do you think of Bedouin's idea that Luke could have been, the author of Luke's gospel could have been written by the same person that wrote Marcion's gospel, but expanded his own work at a later time?
This is a no-starter. I'm sorry. Because, as I just said with the lexicography and the semantics, there is such a difference in terms, particularly in small terms, in small words, functional words, that we have a different language in those two texts. So the one who has expanded Luke, or who has cut short Luke, has to be a different person. I'll give you one example. We talked about the birth stories and the youth stories. For a very long time, people have noticed the difference in style, grammar, and wording. And that's one of the reasons why so many people in the past have always said, well, these parts, they must have been taken, even by Luke, they must have been taken from a different source. Another example is the preface of Luke, which links directly into the preface of Acts. Even the hardliner who are claiming that the preface plus the youth stories and the gospel has been written by one person admits, like Backhaus does just 2 years ago in his big monograph, where he compares, or where he talks about the double work of Luke and Acts, he admits thus that the preface is simply an outlier in comparison with the lexicography, the grammar, the style, and so forth. So I think, and I have discussions, of course, with Jason Badoon, and he admits that what he hasn't done in his work so far, because A, the lexicography hadn't been researched, B, because there was no access to a computer readable comparison text of Marcion's gospel and of the canonical one, he was not able to do that. And this is why he abstains from making a judgment on this, but waits for further results of the research we do.
Some link Marcion's name with Mark due to how similar that their names are. From Marcion to Marcon. What is your thoughts on that connection?
Well, that connection is not a new one. It's not a recent one that scholars today do. I mean, Marcion
I know it's old.
Yeah, Marcion is a diminutive form of Mark. Yeah, so there is a natural link to it. Clement of Alexandria makes the mistake, I think, that he thinks Marcion was Mark. So it's no new mistake and no new link, let's say. There might have been even the idea that Mark was a broadening of Marcion, Marcion being the gospel of a small Mark, as it is. But look, these are hypotheses. We can't say more than what we have in our evidence.
If there really was a link there, what would you say the implications of it are? Well, I guess you kind of answered that question. The idea that Mark is like I guess, small Marcion, and then sorry, let me reverse that. Marcion's gospel is smaller, and Mark is the broadening it on the flip side.
Well, look, for almost 10 years or longer, I held the opinion that Marcion was not only the first gospel, but that at best he relied on oral traditions. And again, a result of reconstructing the 10 Pauline letters of Paul have made me change my mind and the position. It's always good if research corrects yourself. Yeah, that's the main aim of any scholarship, I think. Because I noticed that in Galatians, and we have Galatians 5:21, a reference, which says that flesh is not inheriting the kingdom of heaven. As I've said before, now because Galatians is the first letter in the collection, there is no letter before. And in the letter, he doesn't say so. But the same statement, or very similar statement, we have in 1 Corinthians 15:50. But that letter in Marcion's collection comes later, after Galatians. So it's a wrong back reference, which tells me that this redactor Marcion must have had a collection already in front of him where 1 Corinthians stood prior to Galatians, to which the text refers. And this has taught me an important lesson. It fits the fact that Marcion, in piling together his collection of 10 letters, makes use of 2 prior collections. One is a 7-letter collection, and one is a 3-letter collection. Now, by incidence, the 3 letters, which are still stuck together in his 10-letter collection, are the 3, what we call today, Deuteropaulines: 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, and Ephesians. And it is very important. These 3 letters are not stuck together in the canonical collection. You only need to look into the early manuscripts, but also in our collections today. These 3 letters in the early collections, in the codices, are interspersed each time with one of the 7 letters. So, more important now for our question is, Marcion makes use of 2 letter collections when he pulls together his 10-letter collection. It is so natural for me that, very similar, we need to see the profile of a redactor also when he deals with the gospel. And that's why I changed my mind. Because I think if a redactor for Paul's letters makes use of collections, he is also pragmatic when he deals with gospel material. So he rather makes use of collections than of oral traditions. But that is a hypothesis, yeah? Because we don't have any witnesses for earlier collections. The only witness we have for this 2 letter collections is Marcion's collection itself, but it makes a lot of sense that Marcion's Paul is based on 2 collections. If that's the case, I think it makes also a lot of sense if his Gospel of Marcion is being based on earlier gospel types of collections, which gives room, for, let's say, Q. It gives room for the old idea that we have a 2-source relation, that it might have been a pre-Marcionite gospel, or a form of Mark, or a form of Luke, whatever. So there is ample possibilities there that Marcion's gospel may have borrowed from an earlier collection of which we otherwise don't know. Because Q is a reconstruction by scholars. Mark, as it is, I think, is dependent on Marcion's gospel. That is pretty, interestingly, Klinghardt, when I first discussed the matter in 2011 at the Oxford Patristics Conference, where I invited him to a seminar, he was absolutely adamant to state that Mark is the oldest gospel. But when he had worked for 4 years on the reconstruction of Marcion's gospel, he published this fantastic book. You can see that, Klinghardt, The Oldest Gospel and Development of the Canonical Gospels. Now, so after dealing with the material himself, he also had to correct his own views, which he voiced so loudly in the Oxford room. And he withdrew from the idea that Mark was the oldest one. And he came back with the same view that I had at the time, that Marcion's gospel is the oldest extant version of a gospel that we have. Now, there might be earlier forms, which have been borrowed and used for making it up, as Matthias, I think, will not dismiss in principle. But from what we have, I think we can explain the synoptic Gospels and John and further Gospels later most easily, I think, and with least or less problems than with the synoptic questions otherwise, from and on the basis that Marcion's Gospel was the oldest one which was available. And that brings me back to where I started our discussion today, because the earliest comparative reading of our Gospels in Irenaeus, Book 4, he is exactly taking together those 5 Gospels, Marcion's Gospel and the 4 canonical Gospels.
How confident are you that there was, assuming that this is the case, that the Marcion's Gospel did come before Mark, how confident are you that there was some kind of cue or a separate proto-gospel or proto-Mark
As
existed?
I said, not confident at all. Not at all. Because none of our witnesses ever talk about Marcion making use of a prior text, except that they say it's Luke, because he cuts down Luke. But nobody knows of any pre-Luke or pre-Marcion or Q or whatever. And this brings me back. I mean, why? If just take the assumption Irenaeus had been right, Marcion cuts down Luke. Why on earth would any redactor use out of those 4 Gospels the Gospel of Luke? It is, as Tertullian then laughs about, he says Marcion must have been stupid. And I think he were stupid if he had been a redactor who cuts down Luke, but it only shows the ridiculous idea of him being somebody who cuts down Luke. Tertullian says, why on earth had he picked up Luke? Luke's Gospel is not written by an apostle. So if you were to write and to use a text, you would take one of the 2 texts that are credited in the 2nd century to one of the apostles. So either Matthew or John. But then, in addition, he didn't take Mark. Mark is linked to Peter. Peter, the most important of the apostles. So at least if it's not if you don't choose a gospel by one of the apostles, you best choose then the gospel linked to Peter. But that this maverick uses a gospel that is linked to the least of the apostles, not worth being called an apostle, linked to Paul. Tertullian laughs about it. I said, you must have been, mad to choose this gospel. Not worth it. And you can see the logic of Tertullian gives us the reasoning why it is nonsensical to take this approach that he has chosen out of 4 Gospels, the most useless in terms of authority gospel, to cut that down. So I think that doesn't work. But there are other reasons, I think, why, for example, Klinghardt came to the view that Marcion's Gospel is earlier than Luke, and Marcion's Gospel is even earlier than all the other Gospels. One of the reasonings is that all the old suggestions, starting from Irenaeus to Tertullian until the 18th century, was that Marcion's Gospel shows inconsistencies. And they are saying, well, this is typical for a redactor. He leaves Old Testament quotations in his Gospel, although people claim He is against the Old Testament. And. Now, when you reconstruct the gospel as these people like Roth and others have done, you will quickly notice that this is over-exaggerated, overstated. Most important and more important, and this is what Klinghardt has worked out, is the fact that Marcion's gospel has almost no additional text over and above Luke. This might sound strange, but all of the commentaries and reductions that we have in the ancient church, redactors write comments. Reductors, they change text, but 99.9% they add texts. They try to make sense of what they read, and they add texts to what they read in order to make these texts their own. The cases that a redactor cuts down an existing text to make it his own is the absolute exception. We have a few so-called epitomes, so shortened versions of texts. But these are quite often in the historiographical sections. But it is so exceptionally rare that we have a text that, like Marcion's Gospel, is being claimed to withdraw text instead of adding his comments. So it's a non-historical start. Second element, I think, which is important for Klinghardt to make a claim, is a small observation, as I have made it with Galatians 5:21 and 1 Corinthians 15:50. In the opening section of the adult Jesus, Luke also makes a mistake in having the wrong back reference. You remember, when it comes in the pericope about Jesus preaching in Nazareth in the synagogue, he says that the people here, they would have been delighted, if they had known what he has done in Capernaum before. But in Luke, it's the opening story. He hasn't recounted what Jesus has done in Capernaum before. The readers are lost. And the readers then discover that the next section, after the scenery in Nazareth, only there, the redactor talks about what happens in Capernaum. So just as in Galatians 5:21 in Marcion's collection, it is a leftover redactional wrong back reference, which happens. But that shows that the text of Luke's gospel is being based on a previous text where the Capernaum scene comes prior to the Nazareth scene. And bingo, if you read the commentary of Tertullian, you will see that Tertullian tells us that in Marcion's gospel, the Capernaum scene came first and the Nazareth scene after that. So the redactor Luke had changed the order of these two passages, but left the wrong back reference. And that was one of the reasons why Klinghardt started to look into the reversed order. And then he found many, many more material, which was simply overwhelming to say, well, Marcion's text is prior to Luke. And then he compared also Mark and the other texts, and he saw the same happens for the others. For example, one of the texts which I've worked on in my Christ Torah, which was published with Routledge 2 years ago, I've looked at all the baptistry or all the John the Baptist scenes. And you can see they are built in refuting Marcion's strong claim that the law and the prophets lasted until John the Baptist, including John the Baptist, and that from then onwards, with Jesus, came the kingdom, or the preaching of the kingdom of heaven. So the antithesis between John the Baptist being part and the last one of the Old Testament prophets, whereas with Jesus, the great prophet for Marcion, starts the new era, the era of Christ's Torah, or of the New Testament. And you can see Mark does the same as Luke does. They now build stories, narratives around John the Baptist to bridge and not to separate, to bridge the Old and the New Testament, the old stories and the new stories. So this is part of the remediation and working against this kind of an antithesis that we found in Marcion's Gospel. I stop here, but I could carry on.
Does Marcion's Gospel contain a lot of the double tradition material that's also present in Luke? And could it potentially, if it is taken to be before Mark, could it be used, could it be interpreted as a substitute for a Q document?
This is what made Klinghardt believe that maybe we can suspend the idea of the necessity of Q. This is precisely because double traditions, but also minor agreements. Most of these crucial elements which work against the old two sources tradition are resolved when you take into the account the reconstructed text of Marcion's Gospel. That was exactly the basis why he moved away from the old idea that Mark is prior to Marcion's Gospel and that we have a two sources tradition, whereas then Luke comes much later. This was these were the reasons for him making that move. And if you look into his, it's a huge work. His introduction contains about over 500 pages, where he tries to show the relation, the inner synoptic relations, which are better explained, not best, but better explained on the basis of Marcion's Gospel being earlier than the three synoptic plus John's Gospel. Let me maybe add one also important section which he also has in this introduction, and that is to do with the double character of Luke and Acts, which is quite important. Because the beginnings of Luke and the end of Luke, the beginning is the preface, the end is the ascension of Christ. And those are exactly the two elements that you will find link Luke with Acts, because we have the preface of Acts that refers back to a first book addressed to the same addressee, Theophilus, or the person not named there. And the ascension of Christ is the opening of Acts. It's the closing of Luke and the opening of Acts. So what we've got is a strict relation that it has been implemented in the beginning of and end of Luke and in the beginning of Acts, so to have them closely together. So that for almost 2,000 years, we talk about a double work by Luke. Irenaeus makes already that case. The problem that we have is none of our manuscripts whatsoever, of our hundreds of manuscripts, not one single manuscript has these two works together. Luke is always being part of the other Gospels, and Acts always is together with what we today call the Catholic letters. So the letters by Peter, by James, Jude, and John. So the packages, the sub-packages in our codices and in the texts that we have are these, and not Luke and Acts. I think it's the invention of Irenaeus, who packages these texts together because he sees them in his larger collection, which then from the 3rd century is being called New Testament. So it is what Marcion calls a canonical reductional moment, that we have the Gospels together and Acts next to it as a second compound with the Catholic letters. And only then, as a further 3rd sub-collection in what becomes the New Testament, the canonical New Testament, then we have the letters of Paul. And no longer 10 letters, but now 14 letters. And then we have Revelation. So you can see the canonical question again puts us in a position to say this canonical Luke as we have it, with this preface and that ending, presupposes the broader collection. This is a text which has been produced or revised and redacted to serve the purpose for the canonical collection, which only appears in the times of Irenaeus. So here we are in the late 2nd century. Hence, what we've got is Marcion's text and his New Testament, of which title we know, is an earlier collection from the mid-2nd century, whereas what we find in Luke and also in Mark, Matthew, and John, in Acts plus the Catholic letters, that is a collection which comes together not earlier than, let's say, Polycarp, the teacher of Irenaeus, and Irenaeus.
And that's interesting because if it's true, then Marcion's gospel sort of played a role of not only Q, but it would also play the role of Markus, because Markus is a solution for those unfamiliar to the Synoptic Problem that deals with the minor agreements. Why does Matthew and Luke have minor agreements against Mark? So some scholars in the 19th century and later thought that there was an Markus.
Yeah, and you will see this is why Klinghardt, particularly in his introduction, but also in his reconstruction, and you can see his commentary of Marcion's Gospel is a substantial volume. Yeah, so this is this counts 1,446 pages. Yeah,
I have his Greek English Gospel, the Evangelion, but I don't have that book.
Yeah, but it's worth studying because it also exists in English, and it's worth studying because it deals extensively with the minor connections here.
Yeah, because it's interesting because it would kind of make Q and Markus, I guess, the same thing, sort of.
Yeah. No, the minor agreements, I think, help a lot because when you then take Marcion's text next to them, you can see how it develops.
Mm-hmm.
Still, I will not exclude the idea, just as with his Pauline collection, that he might have had access to earlier written whatever it was. Yeah. It also shows, I think I've tried that also to show in my book on Christ Torah. It also explains why there are sections in the Gospel where Marcion had great difficulties to digest, and of course being straight away picked up by Tertullian and commented upon. For example, when there is this talk of Jesus that he has come to bring the sword, to make a division in the family between father and son, mother and daughter, and so forth. And you can see with the delight, Tertullian comments upon this passage and says, well, how such a reductional idiot can leave these kinds of text in there where he claims that God is overall good and the Messiah is just the one who brings peace. To me, it shows that Marcion was close and also trustworthy in the reproduction of what he had in his hands. So he was making the redactional changes, no doubt, because the text is his text, as we can see when we compare the Gospel to the Pauline letters. The redactional language is too close to each other. So he made substantial rewrites, no doubt. But the substance in it, what he found, he must have reproduced in such a way that he even lived with some content inconsistencies.
Now, Marcion's gospel doesn't have all of the double tradition material that shows up in Luke.
No.
He has a bit, but not all of it. So do you think that Luke acquired the remaining material, not
Could
the
have
extent
been.
in the Marcionite gospel from
This is
perhaps
so
Matthew?
interesting. Yeah, could have been. Look, what is the profile of these synoptic people? Whether or not we believe in anything we have to set tonight about Marcion. Park that for a moment. All scholars, all, work on the condition that the profile of the people who have written our canonical gospels have borrowed from others. If that's the profile, you may ask where the borrowing material came from. So they relied on other people's writings or sayings. And this is exactly what turns out to be correct. Because what I'm saying and what Klingenhardt and others are saying is that these people borrow texts. The question is what they borrow. And if it is true that they have borrowed Marcion's text, they might also have borrowed other material. Just as Marcion borrowed at least from 2 letter collections. So he might have borrowed from 1, 2, or 3 other sources for putting together his gospel, just as people used his gospel and maybe other material. These people were scholars. They're like you and me. I mean, they read a lot, yeah? They borrow a lot. They try to make up their own minds. They might revise what they have written. They might be convicted that they have made mistakes. And so what I'm trying to show in my long introduction on the reconstruction of the Pauline letters is that these different milieus from where texts were produced are so interlinked. And that's why it's so difficult for us to disentangle them. But they are borrowing in both ways. People like Marcion, when he borrows those 2 letter collections, he borrows from one milieu, from one background, which is very canonically driven. And he borrows other texts, which are pretty different. And the people who then make use of his texts, they borrow from him. So the people who have given him some stuff, they take what he has delivered and they build on it. And so each side, I think, builds and corrects what she or he receives. It's not a divided world between heretics and orthodox. It's prior to all of that. It is people being adamantly academic. They have schoolrooms, yeah, didaskaleia, we are told. So they are scholars, and they do what scholars do ever since.
And in my final question, does Marcion's gospel also lack the nearly all the Josephine parallels that are found in Luke?
No, that's also interesting. No, on the contrary, he has several passages, for example, on John the Baptist. And they are pretty close. I have made those comparisons in my Christ Torah. They're pretty close to Josephus. Now, the big problem, of course, is who is borrowing from who? Who knows who from whom? People have always been skeptical about the passages in Josephus where he comes close to Christian stories. They are singular, and people have long debates about the Testamentum Flavianum, about what he says about James, what he says about John the Baptist. That's the problem. But it could be that Marcion borrows from him and maybe doesn't know more of the Baptist than what is being written in Josephus. But maybe the people who have redacted Josephus may have done it in light of Marcion and in light of what the synoptics have made of him. So that we don't know. But there are relations, and I would say there are literal relations between those texts. But whether the hen was before the egg or the egg before the hen, you asked the wrong person. I'm not a biologist.
And I just want to remind everybody real quick that the link to purchase Markus Vinzent's books is in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. And the Patristica YouTube channel is tagged in the description below. So go subscribe to it if you haven't done so already. And that being said, Markus, thank you very much for joining me today.
Jacob, thanks so much for your questions. You're always a kind listener. And of course, you are very learned in the material you're dealing with. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Markus.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.